They called it the Sleepless House. In my town, there's this abandoned mansion at the end of Willow Lane, wrapped up in rusty chains and shadows. It's one of those old Victorian places, the kind you'd see in a horror movie. High-pointed roofs, intricate latticework, windows that were long ago broken or smeared over with dirt, hiding whatever might be inside. Rumor had it that no one had ever lived there peacefully. People would move in, then disappear. Sometimes a family would spend a night, then pack up and leave without a word. Over the years, everyone knew to steer clear. When I was a kid, we'd dare each other to go up to the porch, sometimes tapping on the glass panes just to see if anything would happen. Nobody ever went inside, though. Not even the bravest among us. I moved away from town when I was a teenager, but I found myself coming back years later, this time with my own teenage daughter, Lucy. On a lazy Saturday, I took her driving around my old neighborhood, sharing ghost stories and reminiscing about the creepy things we used to do for fun. I even told her about the Sleepless House, expecting her to roll her eyes like most kids would. But Lucy had an unusual fascination with haunted places and whispered legends. I watched her eyes light up when I pointed it out, and she practically begged me to stop so we could explore. I don't know why I agreed, but something in me, maybe my own nostalgia or a sense of curiosity I'd buried long ago, wanted to take a look too. The gate was unlocked, swinging open on rusted hinges that screeched against the silence. We walked up to the porch, the wood groaning under our feet. The door was locked, of course, but Lucy found an open window, and before I could protest, she climbed inside. I followed, landing in what looked like a parlor frozen in time, covered in a thick layer of dust. The walls were lined with old wallpaper that had once been blue, but was now faded into a sad, washed-out green. And then the smell hit us. It was a sour, earthy smell, like damp soil and rotting wood. It reminded me of something I couldn't quite place, something that made my skin crawl. Lucy turned to me, her eyes wide with excitement. "Let's look upstairs." I was already uncomfortable, but didn't want to ruin her fun. We moved through the creaking, shadowy rooms. Each one seemed slightly wrong somehow, though I couldn't pinpoint why. Maybe it was the strange, dark stains on the walls or the sagging ceiling above. When we reached the staircase, I hesitated. I felt a chill wash over me, the kind that makes the hair on your neck stand up. Lucy was already halfway up, though, so I forced myself to follow. The second floor was darker than the first. Most of the windows were either boarded up or so filthy they barely let in any light. The air felt different up there, thicker, colder, and filled with an overwhelming sense of wrongness. Lucy had found a door at the end of the hallway. It was slightly ajar, revealing just a sliver of darkness beyond. She looked back at me, and I shook my head, but she pushed the door open anyway, plunging us into the pitch-black room. At first, I couldn't see anything. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I started to make out shapes. The walls were lined with mirrors of all different shapes and sizes, each one warped and cracked, some barely hanging on. They reflected strange, twisted versions of ourselves back at us, and something about the sight made my stomach churn. I felt like we were being watched by 100 ghostly eyes. "Look at this." Lucy's voice echoed off the mirrors as she pointed to a large one on the far wall. Unlike the others, it was pristine, clear, clean, as though it had been polished only moments before. I felt drawn to it, a pull I couldn't quite resist. As I moved closer, I saw my own reflection, but not quite. The face staring back at me wasn't mine. I mean, it looked like me, but the eyes were hollow, dark, with something sinister swimming beneath the surface. I felt my skin grow cold as I realized that the reflection was smiling, even though my face was as expressionless as stone. I took a step back, suddenly dizzy. "Lucy, we need to leave." But she wasn't looking at me. Her eyes were fixed on the mirror, transfixed, her face slack, mouth open just slightly. I watched her reach a hand toward the mirror, as if to touch her own reflection, and felt a wave of panic rise in my chest. "Lucy." I grabbed her wrist, pulling her back, and she blinked as if waking from a trance. "What?" She looked around, disoriented. "What's going on?" "We need to go," I whispered, feeling a growing urgency. But when I turned to leave, I froze. The door was gone. Or rather, the doorframe was still there, but it was as if it had been filled in with solid wall. My heart started pounding. This didn't make sense. I had just walked through that doorway minutes ago. "Mom." Lucy's voice was small, fearful. I pulled out my phone to use as a flashlight, the only light in the room now. The mirrors seemed to close in on us, their twisted reflections staring, watching, as though we were intruding on something sacred. I could see both of our reflections, but somehow they didn't look quite right. I reached out to touch Lucy's shoulder, and the reflection of my hand reached out too. Only it was an inch too high, like it was a heartbeat out of sync with my own movements. We both took a step back, feeling something wrong, something deeply, horribly wrong, settle in the pit of our stomachs. Then, as I looked in one of the mirrors, I saw a movement behind us. Just a shadow at first, but it grew, shifting and stretching, the dark silhouette of a figure forming, standing just out of view. I spun around, but no one was there. I could feel it, though, the silent, oppressive presence closing in on us. And then, in the quiet, there was a whisper. It was faint, almost indiscernible, like the wind passing through a tunnel. But as I strained to hear it, the words became clearer. "You've come to stay forever." I grabbed Lucy's hand and pulled her, searching for any way out. We pushed at the walls, tried the windows, screamed for help, but all we heard was the echo of our own voices, bouncing off the mirrors, twisted and distorted into laughter. Finally, after what felt like hours, I felt a strange shift. The light on my phone flickered, and then I realized there was a door. I hadn't seen it before, but it was there, just beyond the edge of my flashlight's glow. Without thinking, I yanked it open and shoved Lucy through, slamming it shut behind us. We stumbled into the hallway, gasping for breath. The air felt different out here, lighter, almost safe. But as I glanced over my shoulder, I saw one last image in the mirror near the door. Myself and Lucy, staring back with wide, terrified eyes, as a shadowy figure loomed behind us, grinning. But it wasn't us, and not really. I blinked, and the reflection was gone. We ran out of the house, not stopping until we were back in the car. We never spoke about that day again. Sometimes I wonder if we even left. Because every now and then, when I pass by a mirror, I catch a glimpse of something, someone watching. And when I wake up in the dead of night, I hear the whispers reminding me, "You came to stay." The Ashwoods weren't on any map. If you asked anyone in town, they'd tell you the same, stay out. Everyone had their reasons. The old-timers would mutter about the strange lights people saw at night, while kids dared each other to go in and bring back proof of the ritual stones. There was talk of strange creatures, of lost travelers, of shadows that followed you out. But no one had ever come back with proof, because no one ever dared go more than a few feet in. Except my friend Ben. Ben wasn't scared of anything. If someone told him not to go somewhere, he went there just to prove he could. One October night, he convinced a small group of us to join him on a campout near the Ashwoods. It was cold, pitch dark, and the forest loomed like a black wall. I told him it was a bad idea. He laughed, called me a chicken, and somehow I ended up going along with the plan. It was me, Ben, his girlfriend Sarah, and my cousin Kyle. We pitched a couple of tents right on the edge of the forest, and Ben pulled out an old, faded book from his backpack. He grinned, proud of his discovery. "Found it in my grandpa's attic," he said, flipping through the cracked leather cover. The book was ancient, the pages yellowed and brittle, covered in handwritten notes and sketches. "What is it?" Kyle asked, intrigued. "Just some old journal. I think my grandpa used it when he was a kid to keep notes on weird stuff he found in the woods." "Look." Ben pointed to a page with a sketch of what looked like a stone altar in a clearing. Around it were drawn small symbols, spirals, lines, and strange, angular shapes. My stomach turned as I read the words beneath the drawing. Underscore, beware the ritual stones of Ashwoods. Underscore. I told Ben that we shouldn't mess around with this stuff. But of course, that only made him more interested. He turned the page to another note, handwritten in a shaky scrawl. Underscore, speak not the names, summon not the keeper. Under the light of the half moon, keep away. Underscore. Ben grinned. "Look what night it is. A perfect half moon. Dude, seriously." I was trying to make light of it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were about to mess with something ancient and dangerous. But Ben was already on his feet, shining his flashlight into the dark woods. "Let's find it." So we went, trudging through dense undergrowth, the air growing colder and heavier with every step. Ben led the way, flipping through his grandpa's journal, using rough sketches and notes to navigate. Finally, we reached a clearing. And there, in the middle, stood the stones. 5 of them, arranged in a circle, each as tall as my shoulder, their surfaces etched with those same strange symbols. In the center was a flat stone altar, dusted with what looked like the remains of charred wood or ash. Sarah laughed nervously. "This is definitely creepy. Let's get a picture and go back, okay?" But Ben wasn't done. He scanned the journal, muttering something to himself. Then, in a loud voice, he read out a phrase I'll never forget. Underscore Frathna, guardian of shadows, we summon you to the stones. Underscore. The moment the words left his lips, I felt the air shift. The temperature dropped fast, so cold that I could see my breath. The trees seemed to grow taller, casting darker shadows that stretched toward us like clawed hands. "I don't think you should have done that," I whispered, backing away from the altar. Ben laughed, but it was hollow. His confidence was slipping too. And that's when we heard it. A sound like breathing or wind blowing in slow, rhythmic gusts. But there was no wind. We stood still, frozen in place, listening as the breathing grew louder, more human. It was coming from the shadows behind the stones, moving, circling us. Did you bring anyone else out here?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Ben shook his head, his face pale. The shadows grew deeper, almost pitch black, and I caught a glimpse of something moving within them, a figure hunched over, with long twisted limbs and eyes that glowed faintly, like embers in the dark. I thought I was imagining it, until Kyle gasped, backing into me, his eyes wide with terror. The figure stopped at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of our flashlight beams, staring at us. Its face was indistinct, shifting like smoke, and it made a noise, a low, guttural rumbling sound that reverberated through the ground, filling me with a deep, primal fear. Ben tried to speak, but his voice broke. He managed a weak hello and took a step forward. The figure let out a screech, horrible, high-pitched sound that made my ears ring, and in an instant, it vanished, melting back into the shadows. The forest fell silent again. Did anyone else see that?" Sarah whispered. We all nodded. Ben was already backing away, muttering, "This was a bad idea, a really bad idea." He turned and ran, and the rest of us followed, crashing through the undergrowth, feeling the weight of something following us, pressing in from all sides. When we finally stumbled back to our tents, we were gasping for breath, but no one dared look back. We crawled into our tents, silent, unable to sleep but too afraid to go back out into the open. But that wasn't the end. Around 3 a.m, I heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow and heavy, circling our camp. They were joined by that same ragged breathing and a low hum that rose and fell, like someone chanting a broken, cursed melody. I stayed still, too terrified to move until dawn broke. When I finally dared to unzip my tent, Ben was gone. We searched everywhere, calling for him, retracing our steps back to the clearing. But he wasn't there. Only the stones remained, silent and unmoved, their symbols faintly shimmering in the pale morning light. The police organized a search party, but they never found him. They chalked it up to an accident, that he must have wandered deeper into the woods and gotten lost. But I knew better. I knew he hadn't just wandered off. I've had nightmares ever since. In them, I'm back in that clearing, standing at the altar, and I can see Ben just beyond the stones, reaching out, his face twisted with fear. But he's not alone. The shadow figure stands beside him, hunched and grinning, its ember eyes fixed on me. And every time I wake up, I hear the chant, a broken, cursed melody echoing in the darkness of my room, reminding me of the last words in the journal. Underscore, those who summon the keeper never leave. Underscore. I was working the night shift, doing janitorial work for the city's transit system. The subway was practically empty after midnight, just a few trains running through on their way back to the depot. I was assigned to clean the platform and locker rooms at Emerson Station, one of the oldest and least used in the system. Emerson had been closed to the public for years. Supposedly, a structural collapse in the late 1930s had caused serious damage to the main tunnel, and the city never bothered to repair it. There were other stations nearby, so most people didn't even notice Emerson was gone. But those of us who worked the night shift knew it was still there, silent, tucked away from the hustle and bustle of the main subway lines. People avoided Emerson, even those who worked in the transit system. There were whispers, stories told in low voices by workers who'd been around for years. They'd say that Emerson was haunted, that strange things happened there late at night, that the lights sometimes turned on by themselves. I used to laugh off the stories, brushing them aside as just tall tales. But the moment I stepped foot there alone, I felt it. The suffocating darkness, the weight of something watching. That night, I arrived at Emerson just after midnight. I walked down the grimy stairs, my footsteps echoing in the empty station. The air was damp and cold, and a strange smell lingered in the stale air, something like mildew, mixed with an earthy, metallic scent that made my skin crawl. I started my routine, sweeping debris from the floor, emptying trash cans, and wiping down the benches. I told myself the stories were just in my head, that there was nothing to be afraid of. But there was a nagging feeling in the back of my mind, an instinct that told me to keep glancing over my shoulder. As I was sweeping near the edge of the platform, I heard it, the distant rumble of a train. I paused, frowning. According to my schedule, no train should be coming through Emerson until 5 a.m. at the earliest. I double-checked my phone, scrolling through the transit app just to make sure I wasn't mistaken. The rumble grew louder, the distinct clatter of wheels on rails echoing through the empty station. I stepped closer to the edge of the platform, squinting down the dark tunnel. A light was approaching, cutting through the shadows. But as the train drew closer, I felt a strange sensation, like ice sliding down my spine. The train wasn't on the schedule, because it wasn't a modern train. The train that pulled up to the platform was old. Not just outdated, but ancient, like something from the early 1900s. Its paint was peeling, the windows were dusty and yellowed, and the exterior was marked with spots of rust. The train's headlights glowed a faint, sickly yellow, and its cars clattered and squealed as they slowed to a stop. I stood frozen in place, watching as the doors hissed open. I expected to see an empty train, maybe some broken-down relic being moved from one storage facility to another. But as I looked inside, my stomach twisted. The train was filled with passengers. They sat perfectly still, facing forward, their faces blank and expressionless. Every single one of them was dressed in old-fashioned clothing, dark coats, wide-brimmed hats, gloves, some even wearing veils that concealed their eyes. They looked like they belonged to a different time, as if they'd been plucked straight out of an old photograph. A shiver ran down my spine. Just as I was about to turn away, one of them moved. A woman near the front turned her head slowly, her pale, hollow eyes locking onto mine. I felt a jolt of fear as she stared, her gaze unblinking, her mouth slightly open, as though she were trying to speak. I took a step back, but before I could move further, the conductor stepped out of the train. He wore a dark, old-fashioned uniform with brass buttons that glinted faintly under the flickering lights. A peaked cap was pulled low over his eyes, casting his face in shadow. He glanced at me, his face partially obscured, and I felt my stomach churn. His features seemed distorted, as though I were looking at him through warped glass. "Are you coming aboard?" he asked in a low, hollow voice that echoed across the empty platform. "No," I stammered, my voice shaking. I'm just cleaning." The conductor tilted his head slightly, and his mouth twisted into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "All aboard," he said, louder this time, his voice reverberating through the station, sounding somehow both far away and too close. As he spoke, every passenger on the train turned in unison, their empty, glassy eyes fixed on me. I could feel an invisible pull, something drawing me toward the train, as though it were calling me, beckoning me to step inside. I fought against it, my feet rooted to the platform, but my body seemed to betray me, edging forward against my will. I don't know how, but I managed to snap out of it, stumbling backward, gasping for air. I wanted to run, to scream, but my legs felt weak, numb. As I turned, ready to bolt for the exit, the loudspeaker crackled to life, blaring through the station with harsh, distorted voice. "Last train departing Emerson Station." The announcement jolted me out of my stupor, and I sprinted down the platform, my heart pounding in my chest. I could hear the hissing of the doors closing behind me, the clatter of the wheels as the train started moving again. I glanced over my shoulder, just in time to see the train pulling away, the passengers still staring out the windows, their hollow eyes fixed on me as they disappeared into the tunnel. I reached the end of the platform, gasping for breath, and stumbled up the stairs, desperate to put distance between myself and that cursed train. I didn't stop running until I was out of the station, back in the cold, open air. The moment I felt the city lights around me, I pulled out my phone to call my supervisor, but I stopped when I noticed something on my hands. They were covered in a fine layer of ash. I tried to wipe it off, but it wouldn't come off. The gray powdery residue clung to my skin, coating my fingers, filling the lines on my palms. My mind raced, recalling the strange metallic smell that had lingered in the air when I first entered the station. It hadn't been mildew. It had been the smell of old, burnt wood, or something worse. When I finally made it home, I scrubbed my hands until they were raw, but the sensation of the ash wouldn't go away. I lay in bed that night, wide awake, haunted by the faces of the passengers, the woman's hollow gaze, the conductor's twisted smile. The nightmares started a few nights later. In my dreams, I was back on the platform, staring at the train as it pulled up. Only this time, the passengers weren't sitting still. They were moving, jerking, shuddering, their heads turning toward me as their mouths opened in silent screams. The conductor would step out, his face hidden in shadow, and he would hold out his hand, beckoning me forward. His voice would echo in my mind, a whisper that grew louder until it was a scream. "Come aboard." I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my hands still feeling coated in ash. After a week of sleepless nights, I returned to Emerson Station. I couldn't explain why. I just knew I had to go back. Maybe I thought I could find something, some clue to explain what I'd seen. The station was deserted, as it always was. I walked slowly down the stairs, my footsteps echoing through the empty space. The platform was silent, the air thick and cold, the smell of ash faint but unmistakable. As I stood there, alone on the platform, I felt a familiar rumble beneath my feet. My heart pounded as a light appeared in the tunnel, growing brighter as the train approached. I wanted to run, but my feet were frozen in place. The train pulled up, its doors hissing open. A conductor stepped out, his face obscured in shadow. "Are you coming aboard?" he asked, his voice soft, inviting. And this time, I didn't say no. I stepped forward, crossing the threshold, and as the doors closed behind me, I saw the faces of the passengers turn toward me, their eyes hollow, their mouths twisted in silent screams. The train pulled away, disappearing into the darkness of the tunnel, and I was never seen again. I work as a night nurse in a small hospital on the outskirts of town. It's usually a quiet shift, mostly tending to a few elderly patients or those recovering from surgery. But one night, something happened that I can't explain, and it's haunted me ever since. It was around 2 a.m. when I got a page about a new patient being admitted to Ward C, the quietest section of the hospital, reserved for patients requiring special monitoring. The thing is, I hadn't heard anything about a transfer, and there was nothing in our system to suggest a new patient was coming in that night. But I headed to Ward C anyway, assuming it was a clerical error. When I reached the ward, I saw a figure lying in room 105. My stomach tightened when I realized the room lights were already on, dim but enough to cast long, eerie shadows across the bed. The patient was a man, around 40 or so, with pale, gaunt features. His face was angular, almost skeletal, and his eyes were sunken, closed in a deep, unnatural stillness. His hair was dark and messy, as if he'd been sleeping for days without moving. There were no monitors hooked up to him, no chart at the end of his bed, nothing to indicate why he was there or what had happened to him. Confused, I stepped closer and gently shook his shoulder. "Sir, can you hear me?" He didn't respond, and his skin felt strangely cold. I checked for a pulse, half expecting not to find one, but there it was, steady, though disturbingly faint. His breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible, and as I looked at him, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was somehow wrong. I went back to the nurse's station and tried to look him up in the system. But when I typed in room 105, nothing came up. No patient file, no history, nothing. I checked again, entering every possible variation of his name that might be linked to the bed, but the screen just flashed, no records found. I tried calling my supervisor, but the call went straight to voicemail. By now, the whole situation was starting to make me uneasy. I debated whether to call security, but I decided to give it one more try and went back to the room. When I entered again, I froze. The man was now sitting up, staring straight ahead. His eyes were wide open, dull and unfocused, as if he weren't really looking at anything at all. His lips moved slightly, as though he was whispering something, but I couldn't make out any sound. I stepped closer, fighting the impulse to turn and leave. "Sir, are you all right?" His eyes shifted, finally focusing on me, and a chill ran down my spine. His gaze was empty, almost as if he were looking through me. I don't know how to explain it, but his eyes seemed to carry something dark, something void of humanity. "Where am I?" he murmured, his voice hoarse and barely audible. "You're in the hospital," I replied. "Do you remember what happened?" He tilted his head slightly, his mouth twitching in a faint, unsettling smile. I don't remember. I asked his name, but he just stared at me, his eyes narrowing as if I'd asked a question that didn't make sense. He repeated that he didn't remember and sank back down into the bed, his gaze drifting to the ceiling. I backed out of the room, feeling as though I'd interrupted something I shouldn't have. Once again, I returned to the nurse's station and tried to find anything about room 105 or any sign of recent admissions to Ward C. But again, nothing. It was as though he didn't exist. Then I checked the room assignment for Ward C and felt my stomach drop. According to the system, room 105 had been marked unassigned for months. No patients, no staff records, nothing. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was some kind of mix-up, a record-keeping error. But the more I thought about it, the more I knew that didn't make sense. How had he gotten there? And who admitted him? I decided to do a final round of the ward before morning, partly to reassure myself that he was just an ordinary patient. But as I reached the door of room 105, I stopped. The bed was empty. The sheets were rumpled, as though someone had been lying in them, but the man was gone. I searched the room, checked the bathroom, even looked out into the hallway, but there was no trace of him. He had vanished. I reported it to my supervisor when she arrived in the morning. She gave me a strange look, as if she thought I was making it up. Room 105 is empty, she said firmly. It has been since the beginning of this month. But I saw him, I insisted. He was right there. He even spoke to me. My supervisor sighed, then handed me an old file, yellowed with age. We don't use that room, she said quietly. Not since the incident. The incident turned out to be a tragic accident that happened years ago. A patient, a man in his 40s, had been admitted with a rare neurological condition. He was there for a few weeks, gradually declining, until one night he just stopped. He was found sitting up in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling, and completely unresponsive. They pronounced him dead shortly after. But there were rumors that even after he'd passed, people claimed they'd seen him sitting up in the bed, staring into space, as though he were waiting for something or someone. Over the years, other staff reported seeing him in room 105, particularly on quiet nights. He'd appear, lying in the bed, or sometimes sitting up, muttering to himself. No one ever knew why, and the stories became one of those legends staff would whisper about on the night shift. My supervisor looked at me with a sympathetic but firm expression. Room 105 is empty. Always has been. Now get some rest. I nodded, though I could tell she didn't believe me. That night, I left the hospital and tried to put the whole incident out of my mind. But as I walked to my car, I felt a strange heaviness, like someone was watching me. I turned, glancing back at the hospital windows, and froze. There, on the third floor, was the faint outline of a figure. Even from a distance, I recognized him. His sunken eyes, his hollow stare, that faint, unsettling smile. He watched me for a moment, then lifted a hand in a slow wave, his eyes empty and dark as shadows. I turned and bolted to my car, driving away as fast as I could. The next day, I asked to be reassigned to a different ward. I still work nights, but I never set foot near Ward C, and I never go near room 105. Yet sometimes, on those long, lonely nights, I'll glance up toward the third floor, toward the window where I saw him last. And I swear, sometimes I see him there, staring down, waiting patiently for his next visitor. I've worked in the downtown library for almost 10 years. The building is old, more than a century, and it's beautiful. The kind of place with high ceilings, mahogany shelves, and winding staircases that lead to hidden alcoves and forgotten corners. It feels more like a museum than a library. And at night, when everyone else has gone home and the silence fills every aisle, it feels like something older, almost alive. I worked the late shift on Thursdays, which meant I was responsible for closing up and making sure everyone had left. It was usually a quiet night, and I'd spend the last hour alone, walking aisles, straightening books, and making sure nothing was left out of place. One night, I was doing my usual rounds when I noticed something strange on the second floor. I was passing the rows of the reference section, running my finger along the shelves, when my hand brushed against an unusual space, a gap in the wall, like an opening where there shouldn't be one. It was strange because I knew this library like the back of my hand. There weren't any doors or hidden entrances along this wall, but there it was, a narrow doorway, partially concealed by a heavy, dusty curtain. I pulled the curtain back, my curiosity getting the best of me. Beyond the doorway was a small, dark room filled with bookshelves. The walls were lined with old, leather-bound books, their spines cracked and worn. A single dim light bulb hung from the ceiling, flickering softly. The room had a strange smell, like old paper and something faintly metallic. There was a chill in the air that didn't match the rest of the building, and as I stepped inside, I felt an overwhelming sense of unease. On a small wooden table in the center of the room was an open book. It was massive, its pages yellowed and brittle, and the words were written in an old, spidery handwriting. I squinted at the text, but it was written in a language I didn't recognize, full of strange symbols and markings that didn't look like anything I'd seen before. A sudden chill washed over me, and I felt like I was being watched. I quickly looked around, but there was no one else in the room. Just the shelves, filled with those dusty old books, and the strange, open book on the table. I wanted to leave, but something kept me rooted in place. I found myself drawn to the open book, almost against my will. As I looked at it, my eyes were pulled to a single phrase written in the middle of the page, a string of letters that didn't seem to make sense, but somehow felt familiar. "Veni ad me," I whispered under my breath. The moment the words left my mouth, the light bulb flickered violently and then went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. My heart pounded in my chest, and I reached out, groping for the doorway, but my hand met only solid wall. The door was gone. A faint whisper echoed in the darkness, so soft I could barely make it out. It sounded like my name. I swallowed hard, my mind racing. I told myself it was just my imagination, just the creaks and groans of an old building settling in the night. But the whisper grew louder, closer, until it was right beside me, cold and soft as a breath on my ear. I bolted, stumbling through the darkness, my fingers desperately searching for a way out. My heart pounded as the whisper followed me, relentless, murmuring words I couldn't understand but somehow felt like they were digging into my mind. Just when I thought I was trapped, my fingers brushed against the edge of the curtain, and I yanked it aside, tumbling out into the library. The door was gone. I stared at the wall, my mind reeling. There was no doorway, no hidden room, just solid wall and shelves of reference books, exactly as it had always been. I stumbled down the stairs, breathing heavily, trying to shake off the cold dread that clung to me. I closed up the library as quickly as I could, the whispers still echoing in my ears, fading but never fully gone. For days, I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of my mind, maybe some forgotten storage room that I'd stumbled into by mistake. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me out of that room, something that was still there, lurking in the dark corners of the library. A week later, I was closing up again, doing my usual rounds, when I noticed something strange. There was a single book lying on the table in the reference section, as if someone had left it there. But when I picked it up, I felt my heart skip a beat. It was the book from the hidden room, the one with the strange symbols and markings. And it was open to the same page, with the same phrase written in that spidery handwriting. Asterisk, Veni ad me. Asterisk. My hands shook as I held the book, and I felt a familiar, suffocating coldness creeping over me. I wanted to put it down to run, but before I could move, I felt that same whisper, right beside me, calling my name. I dropped the book and backed away, my heart racing. As I looked around the empty library, I realized that the shadows were deeper than they should have been, pooling in the corners, shifting and moving as if they were alive. The whispers grew louder, filling the air, pressing in on me from all sides. I stumbled back, my gaze falling on the open book. The letters on the page were changing, shifting and twisting into new words, words I could read, as though the book was speaking directly to me. "You came to me," it read. Asterisk, "Now I come to you." Asterisk. The lights flickered, and I felt the air grow colder, the shadows creeping closer, wrapping around me. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place as the shadows closed in, the whispers turning into a low, menacing laughter that echoed through the empty library. The last thing I saw was a figure stepping out of the darkness, its face obscured, its hand reaching out toward me. Then the lights went out. The next morning, the library staff found the building empty. There was no sign of me, no sign of a struggle, only a single book lying open on the table in the reference section, with a new phrase scrawled in spidery handwriting on the last page. Asterisk, Veni ad me. Asterisk. To this day, they say that if you're alone in the library at night, you can sometimes hear faint whispers coming from the second floor, calling out to anyone who dares to listen. And sometimes, when the lights flicker just right, a doorway will appear. A doorway to a forgotten room, filled with shelves of old, dusty books and a single book lying open on the table, waiting for the next reader to come in and answer its call.